Have you ever made a promise so deep that time, hardship, even life itself could never erase it? Most of us think we know what loyalty means, until the moment comes when keeping your word costs more than we ever expected. Tonight, under the cold weight of a forgotten city, one man will be asked, what is a promise worth, when no one else remembers it but you? The night was brutal. Wind slashed between the abandoned buildings, rattling old signs and sending loose paper skittering across the broken sidewalks. Streetlights flickered overhead, throwing sickly yellow halos onto the cracked pavement. From the shadows emerged a man in a threadbare military jacket, the patches faded, the fabric worn almost transparent at the seams. His boots, once polished and proud, dragged softly against the concrete, soles flapping with each exhausted step. He walked without urgency, but with a heaviness that pressed down on his shoulders. Not from the cold. Not even from hunger. But from the knowledge that someone else was waiting for him. Someone weaker. Someone depending on a promise made a lifetime ago, under a very different sky. At the mouth of a narrow alley, the man paused. Nestled against a dumpster, covered by a blanket so thin it could barely fight the night air, lay a figure barely stirring. The man crouched down slowly, his joints protesting, and checked the shallow breathing of the bundle beneath the blanket. Still alive. But barely. He straightened with difficulty, looking out across the street. Through the swirling mist and the grime-smeared windows, he saw it, a small, lonely convenience store. Inside, light and warmth and rows of food gleamed like something from another life. He stood there for a long moment, the cold gnawing at his resolve. In his chest, the memory of gunfire and shouted promises burned just beneath the surface. He had made a vow once. It hadn't been written down. No ceremony. No applause. Just one soldier looking another in the eye and saying, I won't leave you behind. And promises like that, they don't fade, even when the world does. With a deep, steadying breath, he stepped off the curb and crossed the street, the weight of all those years trailing behind him like a broken flag. The door chimed softly as he pushed it open, the faintest sound against the howling wind outside. The fluorescent lights inside the store hummed low, casting a sickly glow over shelves lined with cans and crinkled plastic bags. No one noticed him at first. Just another ghost among the forgotten. He stood there for a moment, the warmth brushing his skin like a memory he wasn't sure he deserved. His eyes drifted across the aisles, past the candy bars and bottles of soda, searching for something simple. Something pure. A loaf of bread. A carton of milk. That would be enough. Maybe more than enough. He moved slowly, careful not to draw attention. The bread crinkled softly in his hands as he tucked it under his coat. The milk was cold against his ribs. For a heartbeat, it felt almost normal. Like maybe he belonged here among the everyday noise of life. But that feeling passed just as quickly as it had come. From behind the counter, a teenage clerk glanced up, his gaze sharp and suspicious. The man lowered his head, already knowing what would happen next. A soft buzz rang through the store. A silent alarm tripped. Somewhere, a phone began to dial on its own. He could have run. Once, he might have. But not tonight. Not anymore. He turned back toward the door, walking with slow, deliberate steps. The clerk called out something sharp, but the words barely registered. He pushed open the door and stepped back into the cold, the loaf of bread and carton of milk clutched against his chest like lifelines. He crossed the street again, his breath coming in soft clouds. He didn't look back. There was no point. In the alley, the old man still lay curled under the thin blanket, shivering, a shadow of the soldier he had once been. The veteran knelt down, setting the bread and milk carefully beside him, like offerings at a gravesite. The old man's eyes fluttered open, bloodshot and unfocused. His voice, when it came, was barely more than a whisper. You came back. The veteran nodded, a simple, small movement that said everything words could not. You didn't have to, the old man rasped, struggling to lift his head. He placed a steadying hand on the frail shoulder. I made a promise, he said quietly. The sirens came then, distant but closing fast. Red and blue lights danced against the alley walls. He didn't flinch. Didn't move. He stayed there, kneeling in the cold beside the man he had once crawled through mud and blood to save. Because some debts aren't paid with medals or money. Some debts can only be honored by standing your ground when no one else would. When the officers pulled up and shouted their warnings, he rose slowly, hands raised, bread and milk forgotten on the ground. They didn't ask him why. They didn't need to. He said nothing as they cuffed his wrists behind his back, the metal biting into his skin. His eyes never left the old man, still lying in the shadows, still breathing, still alive. And in that moment, he felt no shame. Only the quiet, heavy certainty that he had kept his word. Even if no one else would ever know. The handcuffs clicked tight around his wrists, the cold bite of metal sharper than the winter air. He didn't resist. Didn't flinch. One officer patted him down roughly, muttering under his breath, while another bagged the bread and milk like evidence of some terrible crime. The veteran stood still, his head bowed, his breath rising in slow, steady clouds. There was no use speaking. No excuse he could offer that would make sense to the world they all lived in now. The officers guided him to the back seat of the patrol car, the vinyl cracked and stiff under him. The door slammed shut with a hollow thud. He stared out the window as they pulled away from the alley, leaving behind the old man and the thin blanket, the only shelter against the cold. Inside the cruiser, the radio buzzed with static and broken voices. The younger officer glanced at him through the rearview mirror, his eyes hard, unreadable. The veteran met the gaze for a brief second, then looked away. There was no point in explaining. No words would matter. They rolled through darkened streets, past boarded-up shops and flickering streetlights. Christmas decorations still hung in some windows, sagging and dusty, forgotten in a season that had left men like him far behind. At the precinct, the booking process moved without ceremony. Stand here. Face the wall. Empty your pockets. He had nothing but a battered wallet with no cash, an old military ID, and a photograph creased so many times it looked like a relic from another world. In the photo, two young men in dirty fatigues grinned at the camera, arms slung around each other's shoulders, a desert sun burning down behind them. The officer handling his belongings hesitated when he saw it, then shoved it into a plastic bag without a word. Mug shots. Fingerprints. A thin stack of paperwork that reduced everything he had lived and lost to a few lines on a form. Petty theft. First offense. Homeless. He sat on a hard bench against the far wall of the holding room, arms crossed over his chest to fight the creeping cold. Around him, other men shifted and muttered, some drunk, some angry, most simply broken in ways the system no longer bothered to fix. He wasn't angry. He wasn't surprised. Mostly, he felt a hollow kind of shame. Not for taking the bread. Not for getting caught. But for the simple, bitter truth that after everything he had survived, after everything he had fought for, tonight he was here, treated no differently than a common thief. A young clerk at a convenience store would sleep easy tonight, proud of having done the right thing. The officers would clock out, drive home to warm beds and waiting families. And the man he had tried to save would still be lying in a frozen alley, clutching a loaf of bread like it was a miracle. He closed his eyes and let the silence press down on him, heavier than the handcuffs. This wasn't how it was supposed to end. Not for men like him. Not for promises kept. But life didn't write its endings to match the stories people liked to tell. Sometimes, it just left you sitting on a cold bench, wondering if anyone would even remember the truth when you were gone. The holding cell door clanged shut behind him, the sound sharp and final, echoing against the bare concrete walls. He sat down on the cold metal bench bolted to the floor, resting his back against the hard cinder block. The room smelled of bleach and old regrets, a sharp, sterile emptiness that dug into his bones more than the cold ever could. Time moved differently inside the steel walls. Minutes stretched into hours, heavy and shapeless. There was no clock in the room, but he didn't need one. He had learned long ago how to measure time by the weight in his chest. Across the way, another man stirred on a separate bench. Younger, twitchy, muttering to himself. The veteran barely noticed. He wasn't here to see the living. His mind stayed tethered to the alley, to the figure shivering beneath a blanket too thin to fight the night. A soft clatter outside the bars drew his attention. Two officers walked past the holding area, their conversation low, casual. One of them glanced in through the small window, their eyes brushing over him with the same indifference you might spare a discarded coat. He had become invisible. Or worse, a nuisance. A sergeant appeared a few minutes later, clipboard in hand, barking names like he was calling a roll sheet. When the veteran's name came, he rose slowly, joints stiff, and shuffled forward as instructed. The sergeant didn't look up. He scribbled something and handed him a small card stamped with a court date. Tomorrow. Judge Mason, the man muttered without emotion. Don't miss it. The veteran nodded once, taking the card between trembling fingers. He was led down another corridor, past cells, past doors that locked with mechanical precision, until they reached a narrow processing room. There, they handed him back his battered wallet, his creased photograph, and the threadbare jacket he had worn in. No apology. No acknowledgement. Just transactions, like returning tools after a job poorly done. The veteran slid the photograph carefully into the wallet, lingering for half a heartbeat on the faces frozen there. Young. Whole. Believing in something bigger than themselves. He tucked the wallet away and shrugged on the jacket, the familiar weight settling over his shoulders like a second skin. For a brief moment, he closed his eyes, centering himself. Outside, the city waited. Indifferent. Unchanged. As he stepped through the final steel door and into the brittle morning air, he saw people rushing past, coats pulled tight, heads down, lives moving forward without so much as a glance toward the man who had fought for a freedom they now took for granted. One woman, her coffee in one hand and her phone in the other, brushed close to him on the sidewalk without noticing. Another man cursed under his breath when the veteran's slow steps made him sidestep around. He had disappeared from their world long before tonight. Now, he was just catching up to the truth of it. Pulling his jacket tighter around him, he started the long walk to the courthouse. Not because he believed justice was waiting for him there. Not because he had hope left. But because even after everything, some promises, to stand your ground, to finish what you start, still mattered. Even if nobody else could see it anymore. The courtroom buzzed with quiet disinterest. Papers shuffled. A cough broke the stillness. Somewhere near the back, someone sighed, bored before the case even began. The judge, her robe worn soft with time, looked over her glasses and called his name. The veteran rose, slow and stiff. His boots scraped softly against the wooden floor as he moved to stand before her. The prosecutor spoke first, his words brisk, efficient. Shoplifting. Bread and milk. First offense. No priors. It could have ended there. Another file closed. Another man forgotten. Judge Mason set the papers down and studied him for a long moment. Her voice, when it came, was even. Professional. Is there anything you wish to say? The veteran shifted on his feet. His fingers, gnarled and cracked, clutched the hem of his jacket like it was the last anchor he had left. He drew a breath that seemed to scrape the inside of his chest. I took it, he said, voice rough but steady. No one made me. The judge waited, pen poised, but didn't press. He swallowed once, the movement slow, deliberate. I didn't steal to fill my own belly, he said. He glanced toward the floor, then back at her, holding her gaze like a man who had nothing left to lose. An old friend, a brother, he said. He was lying out there. Cold. Hungry. Dying maybe. His voice cracked then, just a hairline fracture. I made him a promise, he said, softer now. Long before any of this, that I wouldn't leave him behind. Silence thickened the room. Even the bailiff, who had been idly shifting papers, froze. I couldn't break it, the veteran finished, almost whispering. Not after everything. He let the words hang in the air. Didn't try to explain further. Didn't ask for pity. He just stood there, as straight as his battered body would allow, the weight of years and promises dragging at his spine. Judge Mason set down her pen. She leaned back in her chair and studied him, not as a name on a docket, but as a man standing in the ruins of things most people would never bother to understand. Outside the window, a winter gust rattled the glass, cold and sharp against the world still moving beyond these walls. Inside, the courtroom stayed utterly still. For one brief, fragile moment, the veteran wasn't a defendant. He wasn't a thief. He was a man who had carried something heavier than guilt. A promise. And he had carried it farther than most would ever know. Judge Mason sat in silence, her hands folded neatly on the bench in front of her. For a moment, it seemed even the old courthouse itself was holding its breath, as if the cracked walls and battered floorboards understood the weight of what had just been laid bare. The veteran stood motionless, his shoulders squared, his eyes steady. He wasn't begging. He wasn't explaining. He had told the truth, as plain and hard as the winter wind outside. A soft rustle stirred from the benches behind him. A young bailiff, barely out of his 20s, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His eyes, once bored and detached, now flickered with something closer to shame. Or maybe understanding. Judge Mason exhaled quietly, the smallest sigh, and reached for her glasses. She set them down on the bench beside her, rubbing her eyes with the tips of her fingers. When she looked up again, something in her gaze had softened. Not pity. Not sentiment. Recognition. She tapped her pen lightly against the wooden surface, considering her words as carefully as a surgeon handling a blade. War leaves marks, she said, her voice low, steady. Some you can see. Some you can't. She paused, letting the truth of it settle in the room like dust through sunlight. And sometimes, she continued, the hardest scars to carry are the ones no one else remembers. The veteran said nothing. He only met her eyes, a quiet acknowledgement passing between them. Soldier to soldier. One survivor to another. The prosecutor shifted awkwardly, clearing his throat, but whatever argument he had prepared seemed small now, irrelevant. Judge Mason picked up the thin file in front of her, leafed through it once more, and closed it with a soft, final sound. No drama. No spectacle. This court recognizes, she said, that the circumstances here are unique. Another pause. Another breath. In light of the defendant's service to this country, and the nature of the incident, I am dismissing the charge. A ripple of murmured surprise ran through the room, quickly silenced by a glance from the judge. She wasn't doing this for applause. And he wasn't receiving it for show. She continued, her voice still firm. I'm also ordering an immediate referral to Veterans Outreach. Emergency shelter, medical evaluation, and support services, for both the defendant and the individual he was assisting. The words weren't a gift. They were a lifeline. The veteran lowered his head slightly, not in defeat, but in gratitude too deep for anything else. Behind him, the young bailiff straightened in his chair. No one spoke. No one needed to. In that tired courtroom, filled with the endless grind of small failures and forgotten people, something rare had happened. Justice had been handed down, not with anger, not with punishment, but with a quiet kind of grace. And for once, it felt like enough. The courtroom settled into a hush even deeper than before, as if the weight of what had just been spoken needed room to breathe. The veteran stood motionless, processing the words in the only way a man like him could, silently, with a kind of battered dignity. Judge Mason leaned forward slightly, her hands resting on the bench, her tone steady but not unkind. Mr. Callahan, she said, using his name for the first time. You have done enough for this country. More than most. He didn't respond, just dipped his chin in a faint nod that spoke volumes. I cannot undo what you've had to carry, she continued, her voice thickening slightly at the edges, but I can make sure you're not carrying it alone anymore. The clerk scribbled notes, the pen scratching loudly in the stillness. The young prosecutor, still holding his file loosely, seemed smaller now, as if realizing the limits of the law when faced with something heavier than statutes could hold. The bailiff approached and handed the veteran a single sheet of paper, simple, unadorned, with information about the shelter, the outreach contact, the number to call. It wasn't much. It wouldn't fix everything. But it was a place to start. A way to breathe again. The veteran took the paper carefully, folding it once and sliding it into the inner pocket of his jacket like it was something precious. Judge Mason gave a final nod, almost imperceptible, and banged the gavel once, low and firm. "Case dismissed," she said. The sound echoed around the room, marking an end not just to a hearing, but to something far older, a long stretch of silence and struggle that had gone unrecognized for too long. The veteran turned to leave. No handcuffs. No guards. Just a free man walking out under his own power, battered but unbroken. As he moved toward the door, he passed the young bailiff, who straightened unconsciously, his hand twitching as if he wanted to reach out, to say something, but couldn't find the words. Instead, the bailiff gave a small nod, a soldier's nod, born of a respect deeper than uniforms or medals. The veteran returned it, just a flicker of acknowledgement, and kept walking. No one clapped. No one cheered. It wasn't that kind of moment. It was quieter. Truer. A man walking back into a world that hadn't made space for him, but that, today, had at least seen him. The doors swung open, letting in a blast of cold winter air. He pulled his jacket tighter, the weight of it familiar, grounding. In the distance, the city moved on, busy, impatient, unaware. But he moved too. One slow step, then another. And for the first time in a long time, he wasn't walking alone. The courthouse doors swung shut behind him, the heavy clang muffled by the thick winter air. Raymond Callahan stood for a moment on the wide stone steps, the wind tugging at the edges of his coat. Ahead, the city bustled past, faces down, collars high, too busy or too burdened to notice the man standing alone at the courthouse threshold. He tucked his hands deep into his pockets, feeling the crumpled referral paper pressed against his chest, a small reminder that something had changed, even if the world hadn't. Slowly, he started down the steps. Each footfall echoed dully off the concrete. His knees ached. His breath rose in faint white clouds. But he moved forward with a steadiness that had nothing to do with strength and everything to do with stubborn will. At the bottom of the steps, just off to the side, stood the young bailiff. The same one who had shifted awkwardly in his seat, who had watched, really watched, as Ray told his story without asking for anything in return. Now, the young man stood straight, shoulders squared, hat tucked under his arm. For a second, he hesitated, as if unsure whether to act. Then, in one sharp, deliberate motion, the bailiff brought his hand up in a full military salute, crisp, clean, and without an ounce of pity. Ray froze, the cold forgotten. He hadn't been saluted in decades. Not like this. Not out of duty. Out of respect. For a long moment, he stood there, caught between the years. He saw not the busy streets or the gray clouds overhead but the faces of men he had once stood shoulder to shoulder with. Men who had fought, bled, and made promises in the dirt and smoke of faraway fields. He lifted his hand slowly, returning the salute with a shaky but unwavering motion. No words were exchanged. None were needed. The young bailiff held the salute a second longer, then dropped his arm and stepped back, disappearing into the flow of the courthouse traffic without fanfare or further gesture. Ray watched him go, the small weight in his chest shifting into something lighter, something warmer. He turned toward the sidewalk, the city sprawling out before him, cold and uncaring, and somehow, a little less heavy than before. Each step he took felt a little easier. Not because the road ahead was clear, but because he wasn't carrying it all alone anymore. Sometimes, a simple salute could say everything a man had waited a lifetime to hear. That he was seen. That he was remembered. That he mattered still. Ray pulled his jacket tighter, feeling the paper crinkle softly against his chest. And he kept walking. Into the cold. Into the noise. Into whatever came next. With a quiet kind of pride that no winter, no city, no forgotten years could ever take away. Sometimes, the loudest acts of courage are the ones no one notices. Raymond Callahan didn't save his brother in arms with grand speeches or medals pinned on his chest. He saved him with quiet loyalty. With promises made in the mud and cold, and kept across decades of loneliness and hardship. In a world that often forgets the silent heroes, he chose to remember. And that choice, to keep his word when it would have been easier to walk away, is what made him extraordinary. This story reminds us that true honor isn't in the recognition we receive. It's in the promises we keep when no one is watching. It's in the sacrifices we make without expecting applause. Every day, there are people around us fighting silent battles we may never see, carrying invisible scars, living by vows the world has long since forgotten. Maybe courage isn't always about great moments. Maybe it's about the quiet, faithful ones that hold the world together, little by little. What about you? Is there a promise you've carried longer than anyone knows? Or a quiet act of loyalty that shaped who you are? If this story touched your heart, if it made you think of someone you admire, we invite you to like this video, share it with someone who believes in quiet courage, and subscribe to Legacy of Courage Stories. Because here, we remember the heroes the world forgot. And maybe, just maybe, in remembering them, we become a little braver ourselves.